Hi, Buki. Nice to meet you. Welcome to the Work Podcast.
Welcome, welcome.
Hello, Brittany. Hello, Laura. Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to have this conversation with you both.
Yes, so I hear you have a British accent. So
Yes.
we love to we love to
Can't get
start
rid of it.
getting to know you actually, like your origin story, and you can take that as far back as you want. But tell us about yourself.
Sure. Happy to. So actually, yeah, in spite of my British accent, I was born and grew up for the first part of my childhood in West Africa, in Nigeria, which is really my native land. Really grateful and proud to have had those first formative years in that country. Being of the diaspora, because I spent most of, I was there till I was 11 and then spent the rest of my life in London. I'm nomadic at the moment, but grew up and was nurtured in London, but was really pivotal for me to have that first decade in West Africa. I spent the first portion of my life, I guess not a lot of people know this, as a creative entrepreneur. I worked in marketing and content creation for the fashion industry. I'm very creative. I'm a writer. I'm an artist too. I also paint. And then I found my way to this work, this healing work. I'm now a certified psychedelic practitioner. I'm a Hatha Yoga practitioner as well, although I don't actually teach at the moment, but I'm wanting to resurrect that to weave it in with my healing practice. But I hit a transitional point in my life that made me do a complete 360 pivot about 3 years ago now, in terms of shutting down my old career and business, and shift and dedicate my time into retraining, to commit to this spiritual practice, this sacred medicine practice. And that came through a healing journey. I suffered historically from chronic depression and anxiety, which I then later found out was PTSD to a certain degree, from a series of childhood traumas and then traumas, compounding traumas that I experienced in my early adult life. And as many of us do, and I say many of us specifically speaking to Black people, we, just due to our culture, don't always reach out and ask for help. We often just carry the weight of our problems on our shoulders and kind of like battle on. And I think that, having done that for a huge chunk of my late teens to early adulthood, everything just came to a head in my early 30s, and it was pretty bad. I couldn't not face it, and I knew I had to do something drastic because I'd suffered for quite a while. And this is what actually led me to sacred medicine healing, and this is how I found my way to this work. And fast forward a few years and a training and setting up a platform, and here I am now speaking to you about this. So that's a little snapshot of my journey and who I am and how I came to be here today.
When you were spending time in West Africa, and I know it was like, again, your formative years, so like until you're about 11, was there discussion around healing or community healing or like entheogenic medicine as a part of like daily life? Were you aware of that at all?
No, I wasn't. And I mean, that's a great question because it touches in with some of what I think, we'd like to speak about today, decolonial healing and returning to ancestral practices. No, so I'm an 80s kid, early 80s, living, born in that decade, just 20 years after the country gained independence. So, and the funny thing is, I moved to to the UK, and everyone's asking me why I don't have a Nigerian accent. To be fair, you know, for a good chunk of my time there, I went to an international school, but why don't you speak your language? And it's like, actually, you colonized us. I'm in Britain, and Brits asking me why I speak English, and I'm just like, what the hell? I'm having to educate them on the history of Nigeria. So to answer your question, no, unfortunately not. Growing up at a time so close to post-colonial rule, and even now, all of these post-colonial African countries are, unfortunately, I'm not going to speak for all of them because I'm not that educated about you know, all the practices in the whole of the African continent, but all of these, the ancestral traditions, languages, everything has been demonized, buried, you know, taken off the curriculum, and this Western model has been infiltrated, and you've got so many countries assimilating now to a Eurocentric academia, Eurocentric way of seeing the world, using a Eurocentric, a Western, I should say, global North, the lens of the global North. So I didn't, you know, I come from a family, you know, especially on my dad's side, of physicians, doctors, accountants, you know, everyone's kind of got these very traditional kind of jobs. And unfortunately, also, you know, very religious in terms of monotheistic religion, you know, Catholic, which is odd because it's West Africa. So yeah, all of that stuff. I mean, I'm only just now having the courage to come out of the psychedelic closet to some of my family, because I've got a certification, you know, my practice is growing. I now feel a little bit legitimate. Also, we're a few years into the trials, so I've got evidence to show that this isn't juju, this isn't just, you know, because I'm speaking to like, well, they're professionals, but you know, folks that would have, like my uncles now are now curious about it because of how things are sort of shifting in the mainstream sphere, and in terms of how the trials have been going, and the research that's coming out, you know, to back up the fact that they are incredible molecules for healing, you know, a lot of psychological issues. So unfortunately, I didn't grow up with any of those sort of ancestral practices, and it's what has actually opened that door and that window. Again, the medicine sort of taking me on this journey to back home. You know, we talk about psychedelic medicines taking us back home to ourselves, and you know, I started healing with the medicine using a very Western, you know, framework, John Hopkins style recommendations, like everybody does, only to then discover, you know, as the medicine took me on this journey over the course of a few years, my ancestors actually started reaching out to me on some of my journeys, coming through in some of my meditations, ancestors that I didn't actually know and couldn't necessarily name. I just knew that they were, you know, a grandmother somewhere on the line, not sure whether it was my mom's or dad's side, had to sort of do some research to find out, then finding out that this is all in my lineage. I come from a lineage of medicine healers, you know, so it's been so healing on many fronts, you know, having to go to my grandparents to then sort of question and peel back the layers to find out information about these healing practices, not necessarily all with psychedelics, but with healing plants and fungi still is a gray area. You know, it's hard to really kind of decipher all of this work because everything's kind of been passed down orally, and we're talking, you know, generations back. But these practices were there, specifically, you know, in terms of, you know, healing with traditional medicines, healing with sacred plants and herbs, using divination. I've kind of returned to my ancestral religion. I mean, I say return to it as in I'm researching it, I'm practicing in a way that feels comfortable, natural, intuitive to me. I don't necessarily believe that just because something is part of our lineage we have to adopt it, and it needs to, we shouldn't be assimilating to anything. It should have resonance, and if it doesn't have resonance, then we wait till it does, or we take from it what does and leave the rest. So yeah, I wonder whether I've answered the question. Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't grow up with it, but the medicine has kind of taken me back home on a journey home to these practices, making me realize that actually this healing work is so embedded in my roots and my history and my lineage, and my culture, and this is what ancestral healing really actually is. It's remembering that, and my ancestors are kind of like championing me and wanting me to carry on it. We're in 2022, we can't necessarily go back to the same exact practices. We have to sort of adapt them to our modern way of life and our modern narrative, our modern way of being. But part of the healing on both sides is the acknowledgement of where they came from, of bringing it back, of educating folks that it's okay to return. I'm talking about, there's a whole generation, the generations of people that aren't able to shift that, and I see it in my family, that they will not accept it. I can't even talk to them about ancestral practice, and the fact that my grandmother has been reaching out to me, because that's too woo-woo, it's too juju for them, because they're staunch Christians. So it's sad, that's heartbreaking, that's the root of trauma right there. But that's the work of white supremacist, colonial, patriarchal indoctrination, and it's caused a huge psychic wound, and unfortunately it's not even seen as a psychic wound, even though it is. And yeah, but this is the work of this medicine, helping us get to the roots of these issues, helping us bring stuff to the surface, helping us reclaim what has been lost, what has been buried. So it's magical. It's bittersweet though, because there's the rediscovery of things, but it's also so painful as you're rediscovering to realize how much we've been cheated off, how much we've been because so much of this is originally ours, and we're kind of being sold it back in a different way now. So yeah, it's not necessarily about pointing the finger about who's the bad guy or whatever. It's just, there's so much that we really need to expand our vision on and re-educate ourselves on, but this is what these medicines are here to assist us with. And I'm just so grateful to have found them, even though it came through such struggle and pain and depression and all the whatever, it's it's beautiful, it's magical.
I always liken this to like the wand in Harry Potter, how the wand chooses you. And I think
Yes,
that's like the beauty of spirit and how it weaves through everything, that even though maybe you weren't conscious of it, like it found you, the medicine found you, and your ancestors are like, hi, we're here. And I think it's because we've lost so much, and our ancestors,
literally kind of like that.
yeah, literally, like,
Sorry, I had to
oh, we're
interrupt
here,
because on some of my
here.
journeys that was what
Yeah.
it was like.
And I think the medicines help us to remember where we came from, and to help reawaken that part of us, that we're all energy, so energy does not die, right? It's not created nor destroyed. And so I guess this is a leading question into, you do host BIPOC community circles where you integrate ancestral healing and the medicine, and I'm guessing, so like that's a way for people to reclaim their birthrights.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. And this is what this work is about, because we all come from different lineages. We might put ourselves in that collective, that little bracket of BIPOC, Black, indigenous, people of color, and there will be a thread of similarity through all of these practices. But the idea is it's about empowering ourselves. It really is an empowerment model, is what I call it, ancestral practice, because it's when we return back to our lineage, when we research what has been lost, what was eradicated, it kind of it triggers an inner knowing. I feel like it almost activates these latent, there's so much information that's held in our epigenome, our genes, and there's the saying that we inherit our ancestral trauma, but we also inherit so much wisdom, so much knowledge. So much of it is latent, though, as in, like, it's not, we have to sort of awaken it, and we do that by returning to certain practices. And this can be as simple as, eating our ancestral foods, carrying out rituals, just acknowledging our lineage, investigating our family tree. It doesn't have to be anything dramatic, but it's heading down a rabbit hole is kind of encouraged, is the way that I see it, because the more information you gain, the more it arouses your curiosity, or at least it has mine. So in terms of the BIPOC circles, I'm kind of trying to, this work is about bringing things back into balance. It's not necessarily about saying, okay, we're fed up of the Eurocentric Western lens. No, that is bringing things of value as well. In terms of modern science is great. It's amazing to know what's happening in terms of neurogenesis and what psilocybin can do for generating growth of neural pathways. I love all of that, and ingesting all of that information has actually led me to researching epigenetics. But epigenetics has taken me back to the ancestral line to really discover where these traumas come from. So everything actually is connected. It's about bringing things back into balance. But what white supremacist patriarchal culture has done, it is really unbalanced that. It's hierarchical. It's a power over dominating culture that eradicates and demonizes and devalues, silences, creates the same trauma that it then kind of assists you to heal with the tools that it stole in the first place.
Yes.
So it's about bringing things back into balance. It's about empowering folks to see that part of this work. I was lucky, my ancestors showed up for me, but I know that the ones that did were the healers, actually. And they go way back, the healers, the warriors, the spiritualists, the oracle. Well, I'm saying all of this like there's tons of them. It's only a handful that I'm kind of connecting. It's all confusing, but sorry, I'm going on lots of different tangents here. But a lot of people don't start this work. They start a medicine practice, but they don't immediately think, okay, I'm going to build an ancestral altar, or I'm going to try and connect. I didn't do that. I did none of that. I was going down the science route and reading, Stanislav Grof and, Terence McKenna books. And that was literally all that was on my shelf, a bunch of white men's writing. And then the ancestors came through and they were like, okay, when are you gonna pay us some attention? I was freaked out because it felt weird. And again, all that trauma of this is woo-woo, ghost, spirits, all of that. As much as I was quite woo, but at that point in my journey, I'm like, I'm in another dimension now, if you want to compare it, in terms of my belief systems, and everything's kind of expanded. Sorry, I feel like I've really kind of jumped all over the place with this. But to bring it back to the BIPOC, the integration circles, it's about making it okay to speak about these woo-woo things, to, in terms of integration, to talk about a journey where you met, your deceased loved ones and they showed you things, to empower people, because there's so much internalized oppression. There's so much that as BIPOC, as people of color, we have suppressed because of the programming, the conditioning, the fact that so many of us have lost touch with our roots. So many of us are of the diaspora because we've been, we either moved like I did, or again, due to the harms of colonization, really, or and been displaced because of that, or it's because of historic displacements, i.e. slavery, right? That folks have been displaced. So what sacred medicines do is they literally take you to the root. They if you allow, this is all if you allow and if you are open to it, and you can speed this work up by attaching these practices and rituals. So the circles that I hold, I try to really sort of champion or connect back to the ways our ancient ones used to do things, just little tidbits of information for people to inspire, to trigger them. But I try to do it in a way that really still kind of marries it with our current sort of practices, because it really is, they're two sides of the same coin. Everything is really interconnected, and everything, it's so much more of a holistic view. If we don't, we need to just stop this hierarchical way of seeing the world and seeing knowledge, what is valuable and what isn't. Is it because you've got a PhD that makes you the expert in this, or is it because actually you've been practicing and this lineage has been in your this information, this knowledge has been in your lineage and embodied and lived for I know which one I would actually choose to a certain degree, because actually what's happening is we're living in a culture that is watering down embodiment, that's taking away that knowing, that is silencing what our intuition tells us, what knowledge is actually active in our own bodies and in our genes. So a lot of my work is about really bringing people back to themselves, and inspiring or activating them to sort of look at this work in a slightly different way, and to also acknowledge that so much healing, that there's a lot of healing that comes from the chemistry, for sure, but there's so much healing that comes from returning to our roots and weaving in some of these practices and excavating some of this knowledge, and there's no reason why, because even on this training that I did at Synthesis, and I'm in a cohort with clinicians, and it's quite diverse, that but not that many spiritualists, not that many from an indigenous sort of background, mostly quite white, Western, and academic, which is kind of fine. But this push and pull sometimes in terms of conversations, and I think there's this sort of discourse that, oh, indigenous is primitive, it's old, it doesn't apply to now because it's not modern and it can't be right. And you have conversations, oh, how could they have known? Isn't that the point? Actually, without the tools and the science, they knew things that we are just catching up with today because they observed in a different way. So we really need to eradicate this. It's really very patriarchal programming, and it's something that I think so many of us now, the whole world is wanting to shift. We're seeing it with activism against capitalism, because it's what has it is basically what is responsible for so much of the global the damage to our collective consciousness and our collective health, and our planet, mother nature. So I really feel that what these medicines are doing, I see them as agents of change. I see them as activists that have been working with the spirit side. They it's kind of like wanting to cause a revolution, to a sense, to rebalance things, to bring things back into equilibrium. And yes, it's going to be difficult because the folks in power want to maintain that hold, right? They're not going to give it up easily. But I think that you know, the more people like us, and I don't know if you have any, I'm not a mother yet. I hope to be at some point in the future. It's about how we, you know, this is why there's, you've heard of the seven generation, oh God, the actual name's kind of gone out of my, but it's the saying, the indigenous saying about we heal for 7 generations back and 7 generations going forward. And remembering that and really digging to the root of that has been so amazing for me. I know I can't remember the name of the specific tribe. I know it's Native American, but it's incredible because it's about, you know, it touches on things like epigenetics and the fact that, you know, ancestral trauma is passed down. And actually, when you really sort of start joining in the indigenous lens with science, you just, it is shocking because you're like, how did they actually know all of this? You know, how do they, because that's what it is. It's not just a saying that came out of nowhere. It's knowing that trauma is passed down, that actually our bodies biologically change. You know, we almost have a biochemical shift every 7 years. Our genes kind of almost, so every 7 years we have the opportunity to recalibrate ourselves, you know. And obviously the more that we heal, the less that we're going to pass down to our kin, and then the less they pass down to theirs. So this work is really, really important. I mean, in terms of, when I say revolution, this doesn't happen overnight. This is, we're kind of doing this work to pass the mantle down, to keep the planet going, because if we don't, you know, see what is happening in terms of the climate change front. You know, they're talking years now. They're putting by 2030 this amount of sea you know, sea levels will rise by this amount. We're seeing floods happen. You know, speaking about Nigeria, it's one of the worst flooding that's happened in God ever in the history of the country. And you know, so much. Pakistan has been hit hard this year, obviously here in the West, California. Sorry, I'm aware I'm going on this tangent, but what I'm trying to bring forward is the fact that so much is going on that the earth is actually really screaming out for help. Mother Nature's screaming out for help, but I think she's also doing it because she's just a queen. You know, she's screaming out for help, but at the same time she's like, look, these are the tools, you guys, come on, get to it, you know, with these plants and fungi. And this is why this eruption is happening, and they're coming into the Western sphere. So, you know, my work, and I think the work my ancestors are wanting me to champion, they're like, great that you've got your certificate from synthesis, but you need to marry it with this work, because part of the real healing, part of the change that really needs to happen in terms of significant shift, because this work isn't just about healing ourselves of our own immediate, we can't heal and stay healed if we're living in an environment that's still perpetuating the same harms. What's the point in healing your depression if you're living in a culture that is then still inflicting these wounds, or you're witnessing it around you and your family is still ill? So, you know, so it's about shifting from this individualistic materialist perspective, again, very Western, very Eurocentric, to the indigenous, which is about the collective, which is about community, which is about recognizing that you're not an individual in an you know, when one thing is harmed in an ecosystem, everything else starts to be affected, and that's when the decay seeps in, right? So yeah, so this work is so much, ancestral work, indigenous practices bring so much more of a holistic framework than the Western one does, which is why, you know, I'm being the championing it, you know. Yeah, and it makes so much sense to me. The more that I'm digging in, and the more that I'm trying to see the way that they intersect, these lenses intersect, the more it really is validating.
So, you know, I noticed that you mentioned that Nigeria, for example, is can be very Catholic, or parts of it are very Catholic, and the parts of it that are
Mm-hmm.
that have been really hit hard and affected by colonization. Um, and we look at the people across the African diaspora who also have adopted more Western religious and spiritual views,
Mm-hmm.
who then are very hesitant to step back into or reclaim our indigenous and ancestral spirituality. How
Mm-hmm.
can we overcome that indoctrination in order
Mm-hmm.
to reconnect and heal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, such a lovely question. Thank you. Yeah, it's and it just touched on a bit of an emotional chord actually, because you just reminded me of um a student of mine, I should say, because I run courses as well, and I have this course called Rites of Passage, that basically is speaking to a lot of what I'm sharing now. It's really a deep deep dive into using a decolonial lens into healing with sacred medicines, but in a ritualistic way. And at the end of the course, I had, we have these shares, and one of the girls was just saying, I love this and I'm so there, but I go to church every Sunday and I still have this, she was very honest about the fact that she felt like she would be betraying, her Christian spirituality by tapping into this other way because it's so rigid. And what I have learned, because I was baptized, I was christened, I was like, did my Holy Communion, everything. But then I kind of renounced my Catholicism I was quite brave at 16.
It is quite brave.
I was very brave. But I was also just, I was quite expanded when I think about it, not to, big up my own ego, but for a young, I was always living on a slightly different plane. I wasn't very, I was never on the mainstream sort of way of thinking, and that's just the way that I am configured. But to be specific, it's about remembering, because I see everything, whether you call it God, whether you call it the universe, source, the creator, the architect, Pachamama, all of it. Okay, Pachamama is Earth, our planet Earth, but this whole, we live in a huge diverse universe, and if you believing in a greater power, we have to believe that this power only wants what's good for us and the rest of humanity. And this is why I say, as long as you are aligning yourself with what feels right, what resonates, you can't align yourself with everything. Like even in terms of researching my own native ancestral religion, which is Ifa, some of it doesn't resonate, but I know parts of it that don't resonate are the bits that have been written by men and are giving rules for, how you communicate to some of these orishas, and if you don't have this on your altar, then they might get angry. And I'm like, my ancestors aren't giving me that sort of info. That's not what I'm feeling from Oshun, that she's going to be pissed off. Obviously, Oshun might be pissed off at me if I make her promises and say, please help me with this, and in return, I'll give you that. And then I'm like, I just take what she gives and I forget about her and I don't give offerings or whatever it is that I promise. Yeah, then she might be pissed off. But I don't think she's going to be upset just because I didn't put that on my altar, or I didn't get this, but that's me. That's me. And not everyone can be like me in terms of just having that perspective. This is about empowerment, and I think we have to realize that we are born with our own knowing, and our healing comes and is spearheaded by our own inner healing intelligence and wisdom. And if we don't listen to our inner voice, we have to find the strength to listen to our inner voice, and we have to realize that whatever religion that we're from, unless we are doing something really crucially wrong, harming someone, stealing, killing, whatever sins you whatever you consider sins, if all we're doing is something that's serving us and nurturing us, then surely it can't be wrong. And I think a lot of the time, I can't speak to every scripture, as in every religious, I've dabbed into a few, but none of them speak about natural sacraments as being wrong. Actually, it's the, I guess it's again, when you really deep dive into the origins of a lot of, in terms of Christianity, there's a lot that's actually coming up by the fact that, some of Jesus's conversations with God and visions and insights were generated from him smoking cannabis and using mushrooms and all of this stuff, because we have to remember these are natural plants and fungi. I've got a cannabis plant here. This is why I'm stretching out to sort of, I don't know if you can see it just
oh, she's beautiful.
It is. So I was kind of reaching out. They're growing around, and they would have been used by people. So I think it's a lot of work, because it requires a lot of unlearning, and it takes a lot of strength. But I think it's about empowerment, and it's about, like I keep saying, rooting into your own intuition, and also empowering yourself to the fact that maybe you don't have to tell everybody what you're up to, and that's okay. If to a point, because I didn't for a long while, I don't feel like I was lying, but I didn't just share with some of my family, hey, I'm using fungi to heal, because I didn't want to be told off, and I didn't, but I knew my ancestors were there backing me up, so I had that strength. So this is what I would say: tap into your ancestors, the ones that know. They will give you the support and the insight that you need to be able to carry on if you can't actually kind of marry it with your day to day. It's not easy. It's a great question. I don't know if I've answered it very well, but because it's delicate, and I don't want to, I'm not going to poo-poo anyone that's going to church, and I'm all for, I don't care what faith you're from, actually. I as long as it's not harming or indoctrinating someone into being less of themselves, it's not oppressive, it's not kind of containing and boxing you up, great. That part of what spirituality is, however we find it, is it should fill us up. It should actually make us expand into more of ourselves, right? So these are the questions.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Well, they don't want us to be expanded, so that's why like religion is used as a way to control people. And I would argue, so I have a little bit of an argument. I think the Christianity that we were sold, like King James Bible was written in, like, I think the 1800s. King James. So it fit the narrative of the patriarchy and oppressing people, and they left all of the women out. They left all of the, marginalized people, and it's in a framework of control and power. And so when your friend is going to church and she's learning from this Bible, this doctrine, she's not learning the truth, like the real truth that, yeah, Jesus smoked some hashish, and he hung out with the marginalized community. That's why Pontius Pilate wanted him executed. So it's like, if you're only learning one version of it, then that's the version that you understand, like, your framework in. And that's what's happening, like, now with the Republican Party. It's become alt-right, and they're not getting the full version. So I think it is harmful when
it is
someone's faith becomes part of the law.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah, that is getting into such dangerous territory. But this is what they're pushing. But this is why we have to start asking ourselves some questions. And that's what I posed, and I said, you have to ask: is it containing you? Is it expanding you? Or is it oppressing you? And when we start off with sitting with ourselves, with honestly, whatever that brings up, I think is what is going to help sort of align that individual. But it's not easy. I completely agree with everything you said, Laura, wholeheartedly. But not everyone is prepared to make that leap, to sort of to even think outside of that. They might feel it, but because this indoctrination is so deep, you know, I grew up with the thought that if I did certain things, I could go to hell and be damned, even thinking certain things as a kid. I mean, that was traumatic. Learning, like having that viewpoint as a child was pretty traumatizing. You know, you kind of was basically, and that's what it is. They kind of, it's a scare tactic to kind of condition, control, program. And by 16, I was just kind of like, this, I can't do this. I really just can't. You know, I don't believe half of it. And I, you know, I just told my mom, I was like, I don't want to go to church anymore. I'm sorry. I just kind of don't, it makes me depressed. And there's still bits that I take away, you know, but it's not a framework that I use. But it's not easy. It's not easy for everyone to find the strength to shift out. I think it's about being honest with ourselves. It's about, because we're living in a time where there's just so much information, right? There's no excuse about not being able to question things or investigate things deeper. It's a question of whether you're willing to put the effort in, and it's also overcoming fear. It's and finding ways to equip yourself in doing that. But actually the most crucial thing, and I think I mentioned it, I spoke about, you know, leaning into your ancestors. Yeah, that this is what ancestral practice does. It makes you realize that actually at the root of every indigenous culture is indigenous ways of knowing, more animist ways, not monotheistic religion, right? You know, so basically I'm like, it's in, I don't care who speaks to me, whether you're white, black, Asian, you know, African, you go back far enough and these practices and ways of knowing came from direct observation of the planet, the cycles, the elements, the use of sacred sacraments. Yes, they might have created cosmologies around this. You know, this is in terms of these archetypes, which is what I see the Orishas are to a certain degree, you know, because they embody these supernatural powers that are the elements and the energies, you know, of Mother Nature. There's nothing, there's no word of Jesus. There isn't a whiff of Mary in Ifa. You know, the whole
Thank
cosmology
God.
is completely different. It's completely different. And I just think, how could we have gone from that to the Holy Bible? Like, but yeah, it's happened. And I see, I don't want to be too I'm conscious of who your viewers are and your listeners are, and I really don't want to disrespect anybody, you know, because I truly believe faith is an important thing, and spirituality is an important thing, and I would hate, you know, for someone to demean my, you know, my belief system. So I don't want to demean anyone's. I just think it's a quick case of being honest and yeah, like really asking those fundamental questions. Is this indoctrination? Is this oppressive? Is this controlling? Is this power over? Or is it serving and empowering? And you know, that's it. If you're able to answer that question honestly, you know which direction you kind of want to shift in, right? Yeah.
I think many of our listeners are questioning um, or have questioned or will question. So I think everything you said is supported. Sorry, Laura, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Thank you.
Oh, no, it's okay. I was just gonna make a point. Something you said was you get to a point in your journey when you realize that the very practices from your indigenous and ancestral cultures are being sold back to you. And you're like, what? And
Yeah,
I
right.
went through that journey like 3 years ago. So my ancestry is Korean, but our like indigenous, but even before Buddhism is shamanism actually. It's like based
Mm,
on
mm.
animism and
Yes,
like a rock can speak to you basically.
yes,
And
yes, yes.
so when I was now I'm starting to learn this just through the help of my ancestors because everything has been lost through colonization. And I'm like, wait a minute.
Yes.
All back to me.
So really, yeah, and it's that. So this is what I mean about the thread of resonance that runs through all these practices. When I was doing my research, writing this course, I loved everything you shared, and yeah, just I was looking at the Mayans and comparing them to Yoruba, Ifa, and just being like, but very different in terms of the cosmology and the names of these archetypes and things, but that the underlying thread is that yes, consciousness runs through everything, giving personhood to mountains and rivers and lakes, and understanding that animal are our kin, and that actually the wind can embody a person, because it goes back to what you said at the beginning of our conversation, Laura. Energy never dies. I think you said that, right? Um everything is basically kind of recycled. So when you think about life in that way generally, and what we consider inanimate things, how could it not actually sort of, it's not personality in the way that we would describe our personalities, but after being around for millennia, of course, after observing, of course, trees have memory, trees have personality, water does too, so do the rocks. Crystals, in so many cultures, are seen as tools for carrying sacred knowledge and energy, because they store information, and then they can reverberate it out. There's so much beauty that has been lost as well, so much magic that's free, because so
Yeah.
much of it is nature based, so much of it is shamanic. And I think that's what Mother Nature is reminding us. She's just kind of like, oh my God, everything you have is here for you, and you're destroying it. I mean, this is collectively,
Yeah.
we're hopefully not destroying it. But yes, it is going back and going back to the roots. And like you said, and I think I voice the same, almost every indigenous culture at its foundations, animism is basically the bedrock for
Everything.
spirituality. Yeah,
So
it,
I
Well,
it, it is.
and there's this common thread between like West African faith and the origin stories of humanity, and the origin stories of humanity in parts of Asia, and the origin stories of
Yes,
humanity for Central American communities. So like,
yes, that's what I was saying, this link. I was like, wait, what? And when you see this thread of resonance running through, there's truth in that, because yes, they might use different names, but they all acknowledge the elements: earth, water, fire. Sorry, I'm like forgetting what the elements are. Air, and you root deeper, and it's because it's all come from the same source. So of course it doesn't matter where you are in the world. They were all observing the same things: the stars, the cycles, the seasons, using sacraments too, because they all were taking
yeah.
hallucinogenic, the entheogenic substances. Most would have, even accidentally. I found these research papers that speak to the use of mushroom use in Africa, in West Africa. They don't speak about it necessarily being, in terms of psychedelics in Africa, lots, but not necessarily a lot of evidence about fungi, other root plants, iboga, for example, ibogaine, and in Gabon, and lots in South Africa. But there's a lot that's been lost, and it's silly to even consider the fact that some of these cosmologies didn't come about from people tripping,
Mhm.
and spacing out and accessing those expanded states. They did. I mean, the Egyptians cultivated, we use sensory deprivation tags. They were doing that by building dungeons deep, locking themselves up with no sound, in black rooms, and seeing what kind of comes up. I've been on silent retreats, not quite the same as a dungeon. Just try not speaking to anyone for 5 days and see what happens to you, in the in the mountains somewhere. I mean, basically I'm speaking about expanded states, and realizing that it doesn't matter whether you're using a mushroom or cannabis or meditation, you will reach the same endpoint, and the kind of information that starts kind of coming to you is very similar, about our interconnectedness with nature, and the consciousnst that lives in all things, and how much sort of history that's contained in us. I just feel that we've been so programmed and conditioned to also devalue ourselves and the power that we hold, as actual human beings, the wisdom that we actually kind of contain, and how much we're able to access when we allow ourselves to get into these states. This is why meditation isn't on the curriculum at school.
Yeah.
Because they want to sell you, get kids hooked up on Adderall instead. I'm like, no, let's implement some mindfulness instead, rather than tapping into pharmaceuticals, giving pharmaceuticals to 12-year-olds. I mean, but that's the world that we live in, it's conditioning, sort of boxing us down and delegitimizing the power of our own biology.
In your journey, did you go through like a period of rage and um
oh yes,
like a period of like kind of
all of last year?
well, you said that you didn't want to disrespect anybody or like point the finger, but I feel like that comes in this process. Like
Oh
I'm
gosh,
I'm
yeah.
I'm still currently in that phase, and I constantly have to like transmute that because like um I mean, let's just call a spade a spade. White Europeans colonized the world, and now we're suffering the repercussions of all of that with climate change
Yeah,
and everything.
yeah.
And so in your healing process, you went through that, and how did you like, or how are you um like moving through that?
Yeah, again, another great question. Yeah, wow, the rage is huge and difficult to sit with, to witness, to transmute. um I It comes in cycles, I'll echo you in that. It's, it's shifts. But it also, part of my transmutation process is sort of sitting with it. After a while, though, recognizing, anger is such a dense energy. It's useful if you can channel it correctly. There's so many deities in different global indigenous belief systems, like Shakti, for example. I think she demolishes things. It's that like
Kali.
Kali, sorry,
Mm-hmm.
Kali.
Mm-hmm.
Kali is who I'm thinking of. Yeah, but uses that energy to the destruction actually causes regeneration, and then really sort of channeling that same methodology, right? How can I use, because you can it's channeling rage, actually sometimes just screaming. Dr. Jennifer Mullen, Decolonizing Therapy, she actually has, I think, this course and this whole method or practice, kind of metabolizing your rage. And she takes people out and she gets them to kind of scream by a lake in in a park somewhere or whatever. Sometimes you literally just need to let it out in a physical kind of way, or you need to metabolize it somehow, release it. And in a somatic kind of way, whether that's yoga for you, or yelling or singing, or doing kickboxing, whatever. But then also sitting with that and figuring out how to channel it into my work in a positive way. And that's really what deepened my decolonial process. If you look at the history, all you have to do is kind of, you might have to slide a couple of years back, but you'll see all the courses, at the psilocybin journeys I'm going on, I'm reactivating this course, I've kind of had to go back and revise some of my own work and reconfigure, bring in more of the indigenous wisdom, really sort of reset what I've learned on my journey, changing my worldview has sort of shifted. But it's also that integration process. Okay, how can I apply this rage to my life in a way that inspires others to make change, in a way that is actually creating progress for me? Because it's a dense energy, and if we sit with it too long, it creates illness. It weighs us down, and anger is dense, and it could manifest in not so great physical ways too. It causes stress. So finding ways to bring it into balance and making sure that it is regenerative. You can't do it in practice all the time. Sometimes you just have to be in it and sit with it. But the practice of channeling it, the practice of transmutation, which is basically what it is, we're talking about alchemy to a certain degree, is also really expansive. If we can use our these denser emotions that we hold as the fuel for our healing, and healing comes in many forms, that is regenerative practice. It requires work, though. It requires actually feeling, sitting, taking time to sort of process, and also application. Okay, how are you going to make these changes? I had a radical shift last year, in terms of my work, in terms of organizations I align myself with, really starting to feel like actually the way I want to embody my future practice and work is from a heart space. And kind of being, who am I saying yes to in terms of speaking on a podcast, and what panels am I saying yes to? Because if I'm just wanting to promote my work and speaking on but serving the capitalist white agenda, the folks that are using just a certain framework and that's it, then I'm not serving myself, I'm not serving my ancestors, and that's just going to fuel my rage later on, even though I don't see it as that. Do you see what it's actually we have to kind of bring it down to a very real level, but not everyone is prepared to do the work to that degree. That's how I've applied it to my life, and it's been a process of radicalization. It's been difficult, I'm not going to lie, but I'm now coming through the other side and seeing how much it's kind of made me evolve and grow, and the fact that I'm just so much more content. I've actually released a lot of it now. It doesn't feel so heavy on my shoulders. I'm not as easily triggered. And the thing about rage is that it keeps us at that, we're on the edge a lot, and are more able to be triggered very easily by certain things, which
compounded.
It's just exhausting. It's it's exhausting because you're having to recalibrate your nervous system every time, and so it's unfortunately, though, it's the weight that we, a lot of the time, and I'm not saying there's so many people that have rage right now in terms of everything that's happening in the world, in terms of the repercussions of late stage capitalism, but so we're all suffering, but I do feel people of color suffer more. We're carrying more of that weight because we've historically been traumatized. We've inherited so much of the rage too, so unfortunately we have to do so much more work at metabolizing it, at recalibrating ourselves, and that isn't necessarily fair. But it is unfortunately the world we live in.
At least we have
So
resilience.
sorry.
I said at least we have resilience, which we
Mm-hmm.
can't say to
We
our palm-colored friends.
yes, we do. We definitely do. And I'm so thankful for that. No, I hear you. We and I've seen it, and it's shocking to see the level at which some people can't cope with just some, what I consider quite banal things, and it's kind of just like
we can't even say the word white, like that's how fragile they've become.
yes,
Oh
We have to
gosh,
make
yes,
yeah.
we have to like make other words to make them feel comfortable.
Oh my
So
goodness. Like
yes,
how? What?
yes,
Don't you just sometimes
yes.
look at this world and you're just like, what is going on?
yeah,
Are you
how did
No,
we get here?
really, that's it. I got to a point where I was like, but also I mean, I don't mean this to sound, I'm just conscious of how it may sound. We have some responsibility in that too. So I
Say
got to a
more.
point was like, how much am I going to tolerate before I actually just start saying no? Where are it's about boundary building too. I spent a chunk of my life, like you say, assimilating to whiteness, um, assimilating to a version of me that made white existence around me okay,
Yeah,
that made fragility comfortable. And
yes.
then I got to the stage where I was like, no, that is part of your trauma, Buki. That is part of your pain. That is part of your rage. You
Mm-hmm.
have to learn. So it's a process of unlearning. But
Mm-hmm.
once we do the work, things start peeling, literally, especially when you're incorporating it with spiritual practices, sacred plant and fungi work, it starts to just come off. It really actually just starts to unravel, right? It really does, because it's an energetic kind of process too. You just find energetically, people start shifting out and you're attracting different types in. And but it's conscious work. You have to also, you have to be consciously practicing and consciously aware. But yeah, the fragility aspect and the resilience aspect, there are people that are doing the work, and I'm for that. I'm kind of like, if you're dedicated and you are wanting to change too, and I'm speaking to white folks, then yes, come and learn with me. So
Mm-hmm.
because in order for real continuous change to happen, more of us have to be, in this movement,
Mm-hmm.
the decolonization movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we can collectively, as people of the global South, BIPOC, pave the change. But if we don't have white folks on board too, we're just going to hit this, and
Yes.
we're in it, this resistance. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm there trying to, poach white folks. It's more just the doors are open for those that want to do the want to do the work.
I love the word that you use.
It's a thing, but yeah, it's difficult work, isn't it? It's just not easy existing as a woman of color, a person of color in this white supremacist, patriarchal, conditioned world.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's a constant fight. But if we lean into our hearts and we equip ourselves with the tools of our ancestors, this is the thing. This is why I call it empowerment, because it has empowered me so much to break out of this. I grew up in, I'm not in the UK currently, but it was a baptism of fire. That's what caused me so much psychic wounding at that age that I didn't realize, because I shrunk into myself. I went from living in a country where I was seeing people like me everywhere to then a place where I was a minority, but more than that, couldn't see myself represented in anything, not on the TV, not, I'd go shopping with my mum and wanting to buy magazines. And this is even as a kid, you know, buying, you know, teen magazine, like everything was so white, that I just shrunk, and I developed such, this is why my anxiety, that's the root of my anxiety. The having to sort of assimilate to whiteness, having to sort of relinquish my roots to a certain, to speak in a certain way, being shy of my name because no one could pronounce it properly.
No one would pronounce it properly.
Exactly. I started off with an afro, was teased about that, started chemically straightening my hair. No. You know, and you think, oh my God, I was basically erasing my blackness for a good portion of my late teens and early 20s, because you're trying to just fit in. You're trying to fit in, you know. You're trying to fit in, but also it's not just that. You see less of yourself, so you start your
emulating
confidence,
what you see.
your sense of, yes, you emulate what you see, but you also then sort of, because everything is so, it's not conscious though, that this is where the damage is. And it becomes internalized. You know, you start to devalue yourself because that's how you are represented. You know, if you're the minority, if you're seen as lesser than, you know, walking around. And unfortunately for me, because my mum wanted us to live in less crime ridden, and, you know, not that we were affluent at all, actually not. I grew up in a single parent household. Money was tight. It was difficult for me growing up, but I lived in very white neighborhoods because they were the ones that were safer, you know. So at that time too, my young brain was just like, right, you start thinking, oh, black, you know, why are we associated with crime? Why are black folks associated with, you know, shitty place? You know, that I didn't have that growing up in West Africa. That wasn't what my world was. You know, that yes, there was a hierarchy in class, but not in the same way, you know, not in a racial sort of dynamic. And also just, yeah, the things it does to your psyche. Erasure is trauma. Erasure is trauma, and it's active erasure because there was so much segregation, less visibility, you know. And I mean that in, you know, in schools everywhere. You know, I spent so much of my first couple of decades there being the only black person in the room all the time. You know, it's I'm sorry, I don't even know why I went into this rant, but yeah, it's just funny then to then witness fragility, and you just think, wow. I had a yoga teacher tell me once, and wait for this, you know, she ran a retreat in South Africa with a white colleague, and she was like, oh, Johannesburg was great, but then she named another city and she was like, oh my God, I couldn't cope. There were just like, there were no white people, basically. Like, she was like, there was just too many black people. I was like, wait, you went to South Africa, what were you expecting? I mean, she couldn't cope because it's like, for 2 days you were a minority in a space and you could not cope.
Oh my gosh, could you even imagine? Could you even imagine? That's so wild to me.
I was like, she wasn't harassed. I was like, did something happen? She was like, no, I couldn't. I was being stared at, and, you know, I was like, okay, but you know, you weren't harmed. No, I just didn't like it. You didn't like it because, wow, yeah, it's crazy.
Imagine
it's crazy
what that feels like.
I just can't imagine
right?
lacking that much self-awareness, though. I just can't imagine like being that disconnected from the world as it truly exists, you know.
Because
it really is your own little world.
Yeah, because the world has been built, though, hasn't it? Unfortunately, even though, you know, people of the global south, people of color, are the majority, it's been flipped around. Everything has been flipped around. In terms of psychedelics and the Renaissance, it's a flip. There's nothing of a Renaissance. It's a mainstream Renaissance. We should call things what they are. You know, this medicine has been around for ages. It's I'm sorry about the light here. It was originally, you know, how psilocybin actually even came into the Western discourse here in America was through Maria Sabina, a curandera from Oaxaca, had a conversation, multiple conversations with Gordon Watson, who then took the mushrooms back to Albert Hoffman, who synthesized LSD. I mean, literally, this is how it came into the West, into the
And
Western sphere,
ruined her,
folks.
and ruined
Yeah,
her.
and then ruined her. So this is such a it's a flip. But again, you know, patriarchal culture is very good at doing that. It's it's power over tactic, and that's it, what colonization ultimately is: coming in, dominating, taking over, eradicating, because it's easier to maintain a false truth if you hide, eradicate, bury what existed before. But
The
we're
Great
seeing,
Beijing. I
yeah,
call it the Great Beijing. You just like beige
yes,
everything out, and everything
that's
looks the same, and then you
yes,
can repackage it and make it pretty. But if it's not,
and sell
if
it
it's,
as whatever.
Yeah.
yep.
But we keep coming back. We keep coming back and reminding them, hi.
Mhm, mhm,
Still
mhm,
here.
We're still
This time
here.
I'm bringing my folks. This time I'm bringing my ancestors into the mix, and there are a ton of them that
mhm.
are, yeah, wanting to be heard and wanting to be known. And I think we have a responsibility. I see it as a sacred responsibility. If we don't, we're losing our elders. You know, as in just things are shifting. The world, the Great Beijing, I love this, is becoming so homogenized with the advent of technology, and this westernization, this, you know, Beijing whiting out is also what I like to call it. You know, just white it all out, like make everything white, and then it's like white. You know? It means that if we, because if we don't maintain some of these ancestral practices, if we don't bring them back, if we don't sort of keep that remembrance, it's going to be lost. Like literally, it will be forgotten. Indigenous tribes that are, and I'm talking about tribes that still live indigenously, they're shrinking right now. We're, you know, you give it if the planet exists for another century or so, where it is quite possible that we are going to basically all be living in the metaverse and forgetting even how to live like this
Oh
anymore.
my God.
Forget ancestral practices and all of that. Like that's the point. They're wanting that complete kind of severing of anything that kind of keeps us rooted to our roots, because keeping us rooted to our roots means that we're not serving capitalism, we're not serving the system, we're deviating and finding other ways that suit us better and possibly less costly, heal us better, you know. And capitalism doesn't want that. You know, capitalism wants us to capitalism needs to keep growing in order to maintain itself. When capitalism doesn't grow, recessions happen. So we it needs to grow, it needs to evolve. This is why we need that erosion of the roots wants to keep happening, because us being tethered, resilient, standing still, doesn't keep us moving in the direction that capitalism wants us to move in. That's the way I see it. So we have as people of color, we have a sacred responsibility, I think, to tapping back into these practices and bringing them forward, not just for ourselves, but you know, for our kin, for our family, and for our ancestors who you know, worked very hard at cultivating all of this, only to unfortunately have lost so much of it. So I think it's in their honor, but also in ours.
Did you have a last question, Britt, before we close?
No, I could do this all day.
Better to
I
say.
mean, Buki, you are such a brilliant and electric being, and I love learning from you both on the metaverse, in the metaverse, and virtually this way, and hopefully maybe someday in person. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
I
you for
hope
sharing with us.
so. Thank you too. Thank you for your juicy questions and this really enriching conversation. Yeah, it's been so lovely chatting. It's yeah, I find it very nourishing
Yes.
and motivating too. So
And
thank you both.
check out Buki's Instagram. It's so beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
your artistry. Like you have such a
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for the support. Thank you for bringing me on here, for championing my work, and for doing the work yourselves as well. I love what you both do, and I believe that in doing this, this is being of service, to our ancestors too. This
totally.
you having this podcast, bringing people like me on. So bravo, ladies.
Thank you.